Hello everybody, this is Chris with Overclockersclub. It is cooler time once again. So today from Cougar we've got the Aqua 360 ARGB, and the A stands for addressable, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. And then these are the different systems that this will interface with for synchronizing with your motherboard. So you've got the cool factor of a large radiator here, 360 millimeters, with all of the fun that you can have with RGB lighting, the RGB effects. Comes with a little remote there so you can adjust the effects to your liking. Motherboard synchronization. We've even got some RGB in the pump head there, and of course the fans. And you can see there the fans go all the way up to 2000 RPM, so they should be able to move a fair amount of air. And here's the list of specs from the side of the box, the things that I usually look for. Of course, socket coverage. I mean, anymore, they pretty much fit just about everything that's out there, AMD and Intel wise. But what I look for are things like the pump speed. So we've got 3200 RPM on the pump speed, so that thing is humming along at a pretty good rate. Then I look at fan speed. Again, these are 2000 RPM, 600 to 2000. And those are the main things that I usually look at. And looking inside at all of the goodies. Now I actually already had this out of the box because I had this installed in the MX660 that I've already reviewed, but I always like to go through the little user manual, owner manual here, and sort of familiarize myself. Every once in a while there's something a little different, and it's good to know before you tear into it. Because even though you think you know all there is to installing these, if you've installed a few of them, every once in a while there's something that you didn't realize. So other than showing the different socket arrangements and sort of the illustrations show you how to install it, the things that are often interesting here are like for the RGB functions and features here. This sort of talks about how to do it. Here's a little remote that comes with it, and it shows you all the functions of the remote. As for the components, there are 3 of these RGB fans. These are 120 millimeter fans. And something I've noticed with the Cougar RGB fans, they've got a few different varieties and a few different ways of hooking up the RGB. They all seem to have different connectors. Now this is a 4-pin PWM connector. This is what supplies the power to the fan and controls the fan speed. And then the other connector here, this is a little, actually it has a male and female all coming from one line here, but this is a 3-pin connector, and this is what controls the RGB functionality of the fan. So you've got 2 connectors here, and that'll come into play a little more so here in a moment. Another thing on these fans, they do have some nice rubber isolator pads at each corner, both sides of the fan. And then they are 12 volt fans. They pull 0.32 amp or 3.84 watts if that is something you are interested in. As far as the pump itself and the radiator, everything looks pretty standard here from the other 360 millimeter radiators I've seen. It has 12 cooling tubes. I've seen one that I know of that has 13. So anytime you have more water in contact with the cooling fins, you'll have a greater heat transfer. I'm not saying 12 is bad, but if you can get more than 12 in there, that's even better. Now, as for the tank here, you can see right there is the baffle, and that pretty much splits the tank into 2 sides. So one line brings the warm coolant in. It travels the length of the radiator, which is 360 millimeters, gets to the tank here at the end, and changes direction and comes back up to the other tank where it exits, and the goal there being to be cooler than when the coolant went in. So you actually are traveling 360 millimeters down and 360 millimeters back to make a full cooling path. The pump itself, like I said, I had this installed already, so it's got a copper cool plate there, or cold plate, And this bracket here is already installed. However, you can see it slides off. So we've got other cooling brackets for different sockets, but this is kind of a neat, quick way to do that. You don't have to put a bunch of screws in there to hold the main bracket on. I do like that. Now the other end here of the pump, this is the end that has the LEDs built in for the RGB functionality. So this here sort of contributes to the light show. And we've got two heavily braided coolant lines there, and they swivel. And there's also a splitter here so that this end here, 4-pin PWM socket or plug, plugs into the motherboard socket to control your fan speed. And it has 3 connectors there, so you can connect all 3 fans and plug them into one fan header on your motherboard. And then coming out of the pump, a little bit of a mess here, there are 3 cables or wires or whatever you want to call it here. The first one here, this one is your SATA power. This here provides power to the pump, so you know right away your pump is going to be constant speed. This one here, this is your RGB connector. This is what would connect to your RGB functionality like on your motherboard, so that you can synchronize what's going on with the RGB on the cooler and the fans with what's going on the motherboard, if you want to do that. And then this connector here is if you want to connect the fans. Well, you don't want to, you have to get the RGB functionality. This little 3-pin connector that we talked about earlier here, this is what connects into here so that the fans are connected back to the pump, if I can get this right. And that's what controls the RGB activities of the fans. And then the next one here, so you just sort of daisy chain these together. So the next pump, or the next fan, would plug into this connector, and then the third fan would plug into the connector on the second fan. That way all of your fans are connected together, and the RGB effects are synchronized between the fans and the pump housing. Looking at the rest of the hardware, there's this main base plate for your Intel installations and certain AMD installations. And this goes on, of course, the back of the motherboard. Then there's this pump bracket. This is the one that slides onto the pump. This is for your TR4, your heavy-duty monster AMD sockets, your Threadripper CPUs. Got our fan and radiator mounting screws in that package. There's a little tube of thermal paste. LGA 2011, so there's your 2011 socket for Intel. There's another bracket here. This is another AMD bracket. And then the various screws and such. There are a couple of other AMD mounting brackets. These are the little plastic spacers for an Intel installation. And then these little spring-loaded fasteners here. They have a little spring mounted to them. This is what supplies the pressure to keep your pump in contact with your CPU. So the next step is to get this installed to our motherboard, our test motherboard, and then we can put some heat to it. Now there's a spec sheet I'll show now that you can see, and that is the motherboard that we're using here. And we'll use AIDA64 to crank up the heat, put a little load on the CPU, which will put the heat into the radiator, and then we'll see what sort of temperatures we get during the stress test. While I'm getting this little bracket ready here, one thing I want to point out, it comes with these little plastic, they're not really washers, but they're little spacers, and these go, this is the bracket, so you have to get these studs in, but each stud, and it shows in the manual which location the studs go based on your socket. But these sort of retain the studs, so you put these over the studs, push them down, and there's a little interference fit, and that's what holds the stud to the mounting bracket there. So now I have the main bracket for this particular CPU. This is a 9900K from Intel, but these little spacers have just enough interference. When you push them down over the studs, it keeps the bracket from falling back down through the motherboard. Now I'll get the socket or the CPU cleaned up. That's leftover thermal paste from the last test, and I'll get a fresh batch of thermal paste applied. So I've got the pump on top of the CPU there, and I'm installing these 4 spring-loaded screws. And what you want to do when you install these is you don't want to just tighten one all the way down. You want to alternate, and I sort of go in a cross pattern. So I'll do this one and then the diagonal opposite one. I'll get it started, and then I'll do the one next to that. Sometimes you have to push from behind the motherboard there a little to keep the stud engaged. And then I'll do this one, just a few turns, and then we will go in the same pattern until they all are snugged up. And you always want to be careful with your screwdriver or any tool around your motherboard. If you slip off, you really don't want to rake it across the top of your motherboard. So always try to be very careful and just use the minimum amount of pressure to keep the screwdriver engaged. Sometimes use a second hand there to sort of guide it, because you do not want it to slip off and damage anything. And now I'm getting the fans installed. I got the first fan at the top. But one thing I forgot to mention, since I already installed this system earlier, I already pulled this protective sticker off of the bottom of the pump. This is what protects the cold plate, keeps it from getting scratched and dinged during shipment. But you want to make sure you peel this off before you install it. Alright, all 3 fans are installed. Next, I'm going to install, actually just plug it in. I'm not going to really install anything. But there is the connector here for your RGB synchronization. You notice there are 3 holes. There are 3 places for 3 pins on the motherboard. So there's a special connector that only has this arrangement, and this also has a male side to it also, so you have 3 pins. And it's important because if you look, there's a little arrow right there, and anytime you connect your RGB systems together, you need to match the arrows up. And this 3-pin connector just uses 5 volts, and your other headers on your motherboard, it's hard to see, but this one over here has 4 pins. That uses 12 volts, so that will connect directly to like an LED light strip. So you want to be careful that you know what you're connecting, and if you aren't sure, you definitely want to look it up before you just start plugging things in. So there's a special header on the motherboard over here, and that is for this particular plug and this one only. So we line up the pins and push it in. Now this is what will control the synchronization between the motherboard RGB system and the fans, if you want to synchronize it that way. Alright, I got the SATA connector here for the power to the pump. That's connected. And next I'll attach, this is the plug that comes off of the pump, and this is what connects the RGB of each fan. If I can get this untangled. This is what links or daisy chains all of your pumps together. So we plug the first one in like that. Snaps. We'll then connect to the male connector, or the female, actually the female on this one here will go to the male that comes off of the fan above. So again, I have to find the right one. Remember, this has the male and female, so we go ahead and put the male, or the female, I get that all mixed up. I think at my age I'd have that all figured out. Okay, and then we go to the bottom fan. We do the same thing. So we have one male connector available. We take the female connector on the last fan and plug it in. So now all the fans are connected This fan connected to this one, connected to this one, and this goes back to the pump. Alright, we've got the system powered up, no issues. I'll do some fan tuning now with the ASUS AI Suite software. So since this is an ASUS motherboard, I'm using the AI Suite software, and it has the Fan Expert 4. So it runs through a test that speeds the fans up to the maximum RPM and then slowly draws them down. And usually they end up stopping at some point. There, they've slowed way down. And I think they're getting close to stopping. Yep. Maybe not quite. I've seen them stop before. And then usually right at the end of the test, it spools them up to 100%. Alright, so I'll post a spec sheet here of the system we're testing with. And keep in mind the coolant comes in one side, and there's a little baffle here in the middle. You can see the little dimple there. And it separates this end into two sections. And the coolant is traveling down roughly 1/2 of the radiator. It's actually not quite a 50-50 split, but it travels down one side and then changes direction at the bottom tank, which is all open, and then the coolant makes another path back up to where it leaves. So you're really going 360 millimeters down and 360 millimeters back. And something else to sort of point out, this is not normally the best way to have your radiator, because there's usually a little bit of air in the radiator, and it always rises to the top. So when your tanks are like this, your air will rise up to this area, and it could be sucked in through the return line, and that's what will cause some cavitation in the pump. You'll get some weird bubbling noises, some gurgling sounds, because that air. And the air is in there. That's normal. You have to have a place for the coolant when it expands to take up a little bit of space. So if you didn't have any air in your system, then the expanding coolant could push out through like a seal in the pump, and you don't want that. So the temperatures now are holding at about 55, 56 degrees Celsius with the fans cranked all the way up. So now we'll take a quick look with the decibel meter. There's the exhaust side. Now keep in mind, when you have your system in a case, that tends to help deaden some of the sound coming from the fans. And next, I'll do a little thermal imaging so we can see what that looks like. And here's the thermal camera, so you can definitely see the little warm spot there at where each fan motor is. And then looking at the top tank here, you can see this side of the tank over here on the left is where the warm coolant is coming in, and the coolant that has had the heat removed is exiting here on the right. Looking at the back side of the radiator, you can clearly see the hot side on the right. Of course, my hand gets in there. And you can see, as I was showing earlier, how the radiator is kind of divided. And as the coolant loses temperature and it transfers to the other side of the radiator and makes the return trip to the top, it should be cooler than when it went in. And it is. You can definitely see the heat on the motherboard there, thanks to the overclock. Now, as for the RGB functionality, since I'm using an ASUS motherboard, I'm using the Aura Sync software, but you use a little remote here. And it is nice because you can turn the RGB off completely if you like, but you turn the power on and you can see the two different colors. So right now I've got the Aura Sync set to green. I don't know how well that's coming through in the video here. And I can control the colors, for example. I can change manually, and there are different functions I can do. If I want, now I can change the functions independent of the motherboard here, as you can see. But if I want to synchronize it with the motherboard, I hit this button here, the power button, and you basically cycle over to where the motherboard is now controlling the colors. So whatever color I change here, if I change it to blue, then everything, you can see the motherboard changes completely. And you can also change the different features, or the, I guess, different actions. So there's strobing, here's a color cycle, so now everything changes altogether. And I didn't have a lot of luck here trying to get the RAM to synchronize with everything, because the Corsair IQ software controls that, and then there's the Aura Sync motherboard software, and at least I haven't been able to get them to play nicely together, but that's okay. That's no fault of the Cougar cooler here. It's sort of just going along for the ride. But anyway, this comes in 3 different flavors. There's the 240, the 280, and the 360. And pricing for the 360 right now is about $119, $120 on Amazon. But you know how Amazon is. You got to keep an eye on it because the pricing can change from time to time. But honestly, that's the same with just about anywhere you buy your hardware online. So you just have to keep an eye on it and watch for the best price. So I would give this the Overclockers Club Gold Award, given the fit, finish, quality, functionality that I see in this cooler. So this is Chris with Overclockers Club. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.